Welcome to tonight's webinar. Welcome, Sarge. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for putting this event together tonight and allowing me the opportunity to speak to everyone here. And thank you, Alexandra, for all the work that you've done in the background to help us out today. Appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who's taking the time out of their day or early morning, as it might be, to spend some time and listen to me tonight. So I'm going to talk tonight about a couple of different things that are very important to me in my practice. First and foremost, we're going to discuss the idea that function and structure are very closely linked to one another. And we're going to discuss how we leverage that through the process of developmental movement to try to heal our children's brains, or our own brains for that matter. And from the perspective of neurological reorganization, we do that by really leveraging the functional side of the equation. But I'm also a huge believer in the structural side. So I'm going to try to touch on that a little bit tonight. It's hard to build a house that's burning down. So we'll touch a little bit about the importance of the biomedical side of things and how that can be very helpful. And then I hope to answer a whole lot of questions. And as Jocelyn has already said, you're welcome to put your questions in the little text bar to the side, the little chat bar, I guess I should say. And I hope that everyone here leaves with a much better understanding of not only the process of neurological reorganization, but how you can help your children and some other things that you can implement aside from neurological reorganization. So with that said, I will just jump with both feet right into the thrust of my talk tonight, which is neurological reorganization. But I think before I get into that, I think it's always important. I don't know how many of you know my backstory or how I got into this work, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on that because I think that will put some perspective on this work. So my mother is the one who founded this business, and she worked. Her first client was a little boy who had severe epilepsy, was considered mentally retarded, was considered uneducable, and was being ruthlessly teased every day by the kids at his elementary school. My mother took that child and worked with him intensely over a number of years, and ultimately that child made a full recovery. And his recovery took place within the confines of the same school system. So this child, who had been the little boy that was being teased, kids used to take their watches and reflect the light from their watch on, the sunlight from their watch onto, say, the brick wall outside the school building. And that little boy didn't realize that it wasn't a real object and it wasn't something that he could catch. So he would chase those little beams of light and try to catch them, to the great amusement of his peers. He was constantly tripped and pushed and beat up by the boys, and he was constantly teased by all the girls on the playground. He went from being that kid to being a very athletic kid who was the co-captain of a lot of the sports teams, and who is doing really well academically as well. So that was between 1978 and 1982 or 83 when that all took place. And that little boy was me. So when I shared these stories with you, first and foremost, they're my firsthand experience with this program. They're my firsthand experience having been a boy who was severely brain injured and hurt as a kid, who's gone on to be able to fully recover using nothing but the tool of neurological reorganization. I did not have the benefit of chiropractic and what we now consider the biomedical component was in its absolute infancy back in those days. So while my nutrition was altered a little bit, it would be laughable by today's standards. It's also my experience as a practitioner who's been in this work not for 15 years. For some reason, that number has been floating around quite a bit lately. So I've got to figure out where it's coming from. I've been doing this for actually almost 26 years at this point. And the other noteworthy thing is that while I was located in Gloucester, Massachusetts for the first 20 years that I did this, over the course of the last 5 years, I've been in Beverly, Massachusetts. So just a quick little correction there. So how did I go from being that severely brain injured, learning disabled, uneducable kid with a host of diagnoses that included everything from epilepsy to autism and cerebral palsy to the person that you see sitting in front of you? And the answer is in broad terms, fairly simple. My parents taught me how to crawl on my stomach, creep on my hands and knees, and they spent a bunch of time hanging me upside down by my ankles, which is where I actually learned how to read. I became really proficient at monkey bars, which we professionally call a brachiating ladder. And I did a process called masking, which increases ultimately increases by as much as 60 or more percent the oxygen that you're getting to your brain. So these are all functions, and functions determine structure, and structure will always determine function. And it's a loop that you really can't break. And it's a loop that applies across many disciplines in life, not just neurological reorganization. If you are an architect and a couple comes to you and says that they want you to build them a house, the first question is going to be, what do you plan on doing within this house? Because that's going to dictate the functions that you perform in that house are going to dictate the structure that that house ultimately takes. Ultimately, as well, the structure of the house that you buy is going to dictate the functions that you can perform in it as well. So a house for me is going to look a lot different than a house, say, for Barack Obama, right? Or Donald Trump, or whomever you want to pick. They have a different set of functions that they need to perform within the confines of their house than I do. So our houses are going to look very different. Ultimately, we live in our bodies. And the functions that we perform, especially throughout the first year of life, are what lead to not only the anatomical structure of our homes, but the neurological structure as well. So a child who goes through really healthy sequential process of normal development should develop really healthy physical as well as neurological structures. And a child who's robbed of that opportunity for whatever reason it might be, basically they get broken down for me into three different contributing factors that would delay or prevent a child from going through the typical developmental process. So one is physical, right? The birth experience can be an incredibly traumatic experience. And in many kids' cases, the birth process is the first trauma that they experience. Um, and so that can be over obstetric manipulation of the neck. It can be vacuum extraction. It can be forceps extraction. It can be a cesarean section. It can be exposure to epidurals, exposure to Pitocin. The list goes on and on. But we can ultimately change the structure of that child's spine. And when we do that, we can impact the functions that they're able to perform. And I'm sure that everyone on this this conference tonight has either hurt their backs themselves or been very close to someone who sustained a serious back injury, right? Whether it was bending over and picking up something that was too heavy, or it was a sporting event, or whatever it might have been, everyone here has ultimately hurt themselves in one way or another and lost function as a result, right? You hurt your back or you bruise your ribs, and it can be hard to stand up and walk, it can be hard to breathe, etc. A child who's had a difficult delivery can have a hard time learning how to roll over and learning how to crawl on their stomachs. And that right there can pervert the rest of their developmental process. And we'll get into the details of that a little bit more deeply in a minute. But we need to understand that function and structure are very closely linked, with one leading to the other. So, so a physical insult to the child can prevent them from developing according to nature's design. So that's one issue. Another is chemical, right? So the child may have undiagnosed food sensitivities, and they may be foods that the mom has a real liking to. You know, the child might have a milk allergy, and the mom may be consuming a lot of dairy products. And obviously that would be getting into the child's, you know, into her breast milk and ultimately into the child. And that can be causing an inflammatory response in the body. And so inflammation in the stomach can lead to all sorts of different problems, ultimately leading to inflammation in the vein and ultimately inflammation in the brain. And so it could be any number of things. It could be that the child is, unbeknownst to anyone, being raised in a house that he's being exposed to mold that no one's aware of. It could be that he's got pet allergies and there are pets in the house. It could be numbers of different things. But we want to look, it could be that because of just historically what he's coming into the world with, as far as his heritage, his epigenetics could be off. So he or she may not be filtering out toxins. So there could be this huge, the biomedical piece is a very complicated and can be a very overwhelming piece, but it's a really important piece to identify. And then there can be the emotional piece, right? A child who is being loved on and cared for and nurtured is obviously going to thrive, whereas a child who is being neglected, abused, and malnourished is not going to thrive. So those are our three big factors. And I oftentimes think that the emotional aspect also overlays really closely with the biomedical, because a child is conditioned that while he's developing, while he's gestating, a child is being conditioned that he is going to respond to the mom's emotions. So when mom is happy, she's producing happy neurochemicals like dopamine or serotonin. And so when something good in her life happens and she gets happy, the baby thinks, hey, I'm happy. because he's being loaded with the same neurochemicals. Likewise, when the mom is stressed, she's loading with cortisol and other harmful chemicals, and the child is thinking, I'm stressed. At the moment that the cord is cut after birth, that child has been conditioned to respond to its caretaker's emotions over that previous 9.5 months that he's been gestating. So when mom looks over the caretaker, looks over the crib, and is happy, the child produces the chemicals that he knows he produces when he's happy. And likewise, he produces the negative chemicals when the caretaker is in a bad mood, because he doesn't understand the cord's been cut. He or she doesn't have the wherewithal to understand that. What they understand is that when this person is happy, I too am happy, and therefore must produce these chemicals. So there's a big interplay between the emotional side and the biomedical side because of that interplay with the neurochemicals that are being produced. When a family comes into my office, I'm going to do a neurological assessment on that child. And part of that assessment is going to involve looking for any structural abnormalities that my eyes can pick up on. And I'm not a chiropractor. I'm not a physical therapist. There's no licensing for what I do. I'm not a medical doctor. And I would not consider myself qualified to make a diagnosis on a child's structural abilities and capacity. But that said, when a child comes into my office, I am going to look for some of the things that I know are telltales of bad structure. So I have a child rotate their head over their right shoulder and over their left shoulder, and you can oftentimes see a big difference between how far a child can rotate over one shoulder or another. We do the lateral exercise of bringing the head down to either side and seeing, do they have to bring their shoulder up, or can they bring their head down? I have them look up at the ceiling and down at their toes. And a lot of times what you see is something that looks like that. The cervical bones in the spine are remarkably important as far as the wiring that comes up through them and what it controls in the rest of the body. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight, but it is really important to make sure we all understand the importance of keeping our teeth over the course of a lifetime. We know that we want to go to a dentist every 6 months or so, make sure that our dental hygiene is good, that we're not losing our gums, that we don't have tons of cavities, and that we're going to be able to maintain our teeth for a lifetime. Because, getting to 60 and not having half the teeth in your mouth is no way to go through the rest of your life. Your teeth are not nearly as important to you as your spine. And good spinal hygiene is remarkably important. So I'm a huge advocate of chiropractic care, craniosacral therapy, a good osteopath who's going to adjust. Some osteopaths do surgery. The guy who operated on my hip a couple of years ago after I broke it, because I like to break bones, it's one of my things. The guy who did my hip surgery was an osteopath. He wouldn't be the guy, he was the perfect guy to do my hip surgery, but he's not the guy that I want adjusting my child's spine. But osteopaths, craniosacral therapists, and chiropractors can be amazing tools for your child or you through this journey. And I think really important to understand that and how that structural side is ultimately going to interplay with the functional side. Because ultimately our goal as practitioners of neurological reorganization is to teach children how to crawl and how to creep and how to regain or develop these developmental skills that they've lost. But if their hips are out of alignment or they've got massive subluxations in their spine, especially the neck and the hips, but really anywhere through the spine, they're not going to be able to achieve those functions because there's a physical barrier that's preventing them from being able to do that. So I'm going to leave that conversation at this point. We'll have lots of time, I hope, for questions at the end of this tonight, but understand the importance of that. Understand the importance of making sure. I have a wonderful doctor that I've become really close to, whose name is Dr. Heather Tallman Room. And the first time I met her, we were both giving us a talk at literally a town hall in New Hampshire. And she got up and she held up a picture of a carrot, and she held up a picture of a Cheez-It. And she asked everyone in the audience, which one do you think it is easier to make a brain cell out of? It's a heck of a lot easier to make a brain cell out of a carrot than it is a Cheez-It. And when you feed your kids the healthy food that we know is supporting them, the foods that are going to allow them to thrive, the foods that are building them up from the inside out, those are the foods that we want your kids going through the program on. I can help your child and we can make brain cells even if the kid is eating the free Wendy's McNuggets that are being given out this week. But that is a really good way to slow a child's progress, right? We don't want your kids eating fast food, ever. We don't want your kids feeding themselves donuts and Coca-Colas and foods, because foods either build you up or they break you down. There isn't really a middle ground. We need to make sure that your kids are getting the nutrients that they need to build themselves up. And I will tell a very brief story about a little girl who came into me. She'd had an eardrum rupture, and her parents had rushed from Southern Maine to Children's Hospital in Boston. And in their rush to get to the hospital, the mom had knocked over some stuff that was on the dresser next to her bed. And when that stuff came falling down, an article that had been published about me in the Boston Globe floated to the top of the pile. And she picked it up with a couple of other things, and they ran out the door to the hospital. And while they were in the hospital waiting for the medical opinions to be rendered, it was the thing that she read. So as they were coming back from the hospital, she called my office to see if by chance I had availability to meet with them. And I did. So they detoured to my office on their way back to Maine. They came in, and the girl comes in. I pick her up in my arms. She's wild. She's got autism, and pretty severely. But I make a habit of showing kids around my office when they're in my office for the first time, because I don't want them to be afraid of what is behind a corner in the office or behind a closed door or something like that. I want them to feel like it's a familiar place, that there's nothing to be afraid of. There's no shots, there's no etc. So I pick her up in my arms and I'm giving her the tour of my office. And at one point she just leans over and bites me in the cheek, and hard, and draws blood. So I'm continuing to hold her, continuing to have the conversation with the parents as though she hasn't drawn blood. And the parents are looking at me a little bit like, is he going to address this? So I'm like, I'm fine. Don't worry about it. She hasn't hurt me. I'm a big boy. I can take it. But I put her down on the floor, and she arched. And when I tell you she arched, I mean the back of her head and her heels of her feet were the only things on the floor. The rest of her was in an arch, and she screamed. And I looked at the parents and I said, is she taking any probiotics, and is she off of dairy? And they said no to both accounts. And I said, well, if I were you, that would be the very first thing I would do for her. Take her off dairy, get her on a good probiotic. So they called me a couple of weeks later, and they were like, we can't believe that it was that easy. She's doing so much better. And so they ultimately ended up consulting with me. I put together a program for her. And about, I'm going to say maybe 2 months into the program, the parents came in and they were just ecstatic. So this is graphic. So if you have kids, you might want to send them into the other room. So I'll give it 10 seconds. So she liked to smear. So she would root around in her bottom, get poop, and she would smear it all over her bedroom, all over her bedding, all over her flooring. And oftentimes this would exit her bedroom and end up contaminating the entire living room, to the extent that the parents used to have a crime scene control cleaning company on speed dial on their phones. And they used to have this company come in about once every other week to once a month to clean up an event that had occurred like this in their house. I mean, I'm not joking when I say every other week to at least once a month. And when we put her on probiotics and we took her off dairy, she went over 2 months without having a single incident. She ended up going a year without having a single incident. The dad was so excited by all the progress that she'd made that he took her out for an ice cream.
Oh,
and
no.
and what do you think happened that very night?
She regressed.
She smeared the entire bedroom and the living room and multiple other rooms in the house because they weren't expecting it. So diet plays a critical role for these kids. And my feeling is we're talking about major lifestyle changes for a lot of people. And I never advocate to my families that they do all of these things at one time. But I tell all of my families right up front that these are the things that you are going to be hearing me advocate for, because ultimately they're going to be really important in your child's journey. But I don't want anyone biting off more than they can chew at one time. And biting off the neurological piece is a really big piece. So when so we're going to shift back to neurological reorganization and this process. And Jocelyn, do you have something you want to say to me?
Sure. I think this would be the perfect time to actually, I have a little slide show to show them exactly what neurological reorganization is. And just to kind of let everyone know that we've also renamed it neurodevelopmental movement. So neurological reorganization is the same as neurodevelopmental movement. So what we're going to do is show you a little presentation on what is neurodevelopmental movement and where does it come from. And while we're doing that, what I like you to do is take time in the chat room, just on the chat bar on the side here, take some time to start asking your questions. And we're going to wind up going over past 9 o'clock, and that's just fine. And so we'll do the presentation, start typing out your questions, and then Sarge, if you want to dive in and start answering questions after the presentation, that would be super. So just give me a second here, and I'm going to get it all set up.
Hi there, my name is Jocelyn Williams, founder and executive director of Neuralee Solutions Incorporated, also known as Neuralee. Neuralee provides a movement-based educational approach to equipping the brain for life. The work of Neuralee is based on the infant developmental sequence. Every human infant was designed to go through a simple process that would equip the foundational levels of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for all of our automatic functions, such as bonding, emotional regulation, focus, sensory processing, and more. The developmental sequence for infants is as simple as A, B, and C. A. From birth, infants need to be on their tummies approximately 50% of a 24-hour period. We call this tummy all the time. B, tummy all the time will lead to tummy crawling, which includes the belly button being flat on the ground and baby moving forward. This form of locomotion is similar to an army crawl. Not exactly, but very similar. And here's a tip. If a baby doesn't need mittens, they do not need socks. When a baby is engaging in tummy crawling, all a baby needs is a comfortable onesie and a safe floor to crawl around on. C. At approximately 6 to 12 months, babies need an ample amount of time to creep on their hands and knees. Notice the position of the baby. Baby is up on all fours and the belly button is no longer touching the ground. Babies should continue creeping until their creep has developed into an efficient cross-lateral movement. When an infant engages in the developmental sequence, they are given equal access and opportunity to be equipped for life. Some examples are a baby who is a happy little soul, one who is bonded with their primary caretaker, a child who is socially, emotionally equipped to have healthy peer interactions, a student who is able to learn well, and finally, an adult who has the strength needed to make a positive global impact. In summary, the developmental sequence for infants is as simple as A, B, and C. However, the impact is profound. Why? Because the developmental sequence is not a man-made program. It is a process designed to equip the brain for life. At Neuraly, we work with infants, children, students, and even adults. Our process is quite simple. The steps include the following: setting up a video or in-person assessment with our developmental movement consultant, the baby, and the primary caretaker. Training. The developmental movement consultant will review the results of the assessment with the primary caretaker and provide training in the elements of the developmental sequence that baby needs. The primary caretaker will then be given a daily movement plan and support protocols to ensure that baby has equal access and opportunity to complete the infant developmental sequence. For older children, students, and adults, we replicate the developmental sequence. This pathway is called neurodevelopmental movement and is based on neuroplasticity. When given the right triggers, the brain is able to change. In other words, there is hope. There is a second chance. Please contact us for more information about neurodevelopmental movement, the developmental sequence, or to schedule an assessment. You may contact us at 317-936-6797 or email us at jwilliams@nsibrain.com. Please remember that all babies need lots of movement. Thank you for taking a moment to listen to that. And the work that Sergeant Goodchild, myself, and Alexandra Lilly, who's on today, and several others, the work that we do is all based on the infant developmental sequence. And it's been my passion. I love getting to work with my families and my older kids and help them to recover. Some of the stories that we hear are just absolutely amazing. But I also think it's extremely important that we get the word out to young moms and moms of infants and caretakers, primary caretakers of infants, so that they have the opportunity to go through the infant developmental sequence from the get-go and to help prevent some of the things that we've seen our kids, some of our children have gone through. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarge, and you can go ahead and piggyback off of that. And we have lots of questions here in the chat, and I'll read some of them off to you. Okay. Let's start with, would you suggest reflexology?
I don't know a lot about, if we're talking about like foot reflexology, etc. I don't have a lot of understanding about that, but I am a huge advocate of acupressure and acupuncture. And so my suspicion would be that reflexology would be helpful as well. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that for reflexology. It's just not something I've used.
Would you suggest that all kids be on a probiotic?
I wrote a quick message back on that. Probiotics can be a little bit difficult. A lot of kids these days have a problem with histamines, and most probiotics can cause a histamine reaction. So by and large, the majority of kids seem to do really well on probiotics. If you try a probiotic with a child and it doesn't seem to be working well, it can usually be boiled down to one of two things. And I may be oversimplifying this. Again, I'm not a certified clinical nutritionist or anything like that. I'm just a guy who's been working with kids on the autism spectrum for a very long time. Quite often, if a child doesn't do well with probiotics, it's because they've got a histamine problem and they don't do well with histamines. There are a couple of probiotics. I don't know of them off the top of my head, but there are a couple of probiotics that are really good that don't trigger a histamine reaction. The other problem can be that they may have strep in the body, and a lot of probiotics have strep in them. And so that can be a problem for certain kids where the probiotics trigger a strep reaction, often referred to as PANDAS.
There's so many different people advocating for different methods for diet control. How do you know who to trust, and where do you even begin? I feel like every specialist I've seen wants something different and has a different opinion for what affects my child.
Well, so there's unfortunately there's no one answer for that. I have a couple of people that I've been working with for a long time who I have a tremendous amount of faith in. MAPS doctors they used to be known as DAN doctors, now they're known as MAPS doctors, but they have a tremendous amount of experience working with children who have autism spectrum disorders. They know exactly which panels to run. More often than not, they're either medical doctors or they're chiropractors. So they have the ability to order medical testing and make judgments based on the results of that testing. I know that a lot of those of us who are neurodevelopmental movement consultants have used Shauna Pulver. I've been very impressed with her work. Locally, I have a few different people that I use. So local to me, I have a medical doctor who's written a book on combining the best of both worlds. So he's a medical doctor in a big medical practice with a lot of, the regular typical clients that a medical doctor would see. But he also has a very large practice of basically doing functional medicine, much like a MAPS doctor would do. I have Dr. Heather, who I mentioned earlier, and there's a guy named Dr. Angeloff, and then there's a place in Rhode Island called the Bioregulatory Medical Center. They're based out of Providence, Rhode Island, and there are a couple of people there who are doing phenomenal work as well. Basically, um, a simple litmus test. So for a simple litmus test is if they're working in a hospital, they generally wouldn't be someone that I would be interested in consulting with. If they're a dietitian, um, chances are they're following the basic food pyramid method, which I strongly disagree with. Um, so I look for someone who's a certified clinical nutritionist who is experienced with working with chiropractors or acupuncturists or people like me who have a lot of experience seeing kids. And yeah, um, there's yeah, I, I, I would say look for a MAPS doctor or a certified clinical nutritionist.
That's awesome. And for those that were on our webinar, I think it was 2-3 weeks ago, we had Shauna Pulver on with us, and I put her email in the chat box and kind of took a couple of notes here and there of what Sarge recommended. Here's another question. Hi, Sarge. My son has autism, and when he tummy crawls, he always drags his right leg and pulls himself along with his elbows. I read somewhere that kids on the spectrum seem to drag the right leg.
Kids will drag a right leg, they'll drag a left leg, they'll drag both legs. There's about, so far as I figured, there's about 1,000,001 ways to crawl incorrectly, and there's only one way to do it correctly. So for the child, your child who's dragging his leg, that's a scenario that I've seen many times over in my office. Usually what we're dealing with is a pretty smart kid. I tend to think that when a child is using the upper extremities to pull themselves across the floor, that is really analogous to a child who is using the cortex to pull themselves through life, and they're not grounded. They don't have ease. They're usually trouble with transitions. There's a whole list of things that we can go through. The lower extremities correlate to the lower parts of the brain. So what we ultimately want to see when a child is crawling is we want to see a reciprocal leg movement where it's the right leg and the left leg and the right leg and the left leg. I have no idea how that looks because I'm not seeing myself, but
you're fine.
It looks okay. So you want to see this nice reciprocating leg movement, and I usually think that 80% of the force that's driving the body forward should be coming from the legs. So they should be getting a really strong toe dig. They should be getting a reciprocating leg movement, and they should have.
Here real quick. If your mic is on, please go ahead and mute it because we're getting feedback. Thanks for checking on that.
And they should have, as a result of that, they should have an extended arm movement. So the hand should be coming almost across midline, getting trapped under the chest, rotating before coming out again and going. It should be reciprocating, obviously, right? But when that doesn't happen, there's a whole bunch of different things. So crawling correlates to a part of the brain called the pons. And the pons sits behind the eyes, a little aft of center, just below the eyes, in the middle of the head. And it is really important for a sense of bonding. So it makes you feel like you belong to the family. It makes you feel like you belong in the classroom. It makes you feel like you belong in the school building and you belong in the community. And when the pons is damaged, that sense of belonging can also be damaged. So the child feels like he's a black sheep in the family, in the classroom, in the school building, and in life in general. The pons is responsible for signaling the production of serotonin. So that's a really important neurotransmitter. And when the pons is damaged, not being able to produce enough serotonin could be a factor, and that could lead to anxiety. The pons gives us an awareness of pain, temperature, and discomfort. So for a child who has sensory integration disorder, you're going to see damage or a lack of integrity at that pons level of the nervous system. When you see a child who's not using their legs appropriately, you are seeing a child who has damage in the pons. And what's really interesting is that Bernard Rimland was the father of what we now refer to as MAPS doctors in this country. And he was really good friends with Art Sandler, who was the guy that put my program together for me when I was a kid. And they collaborated, and they spoke a lot. They were friendly with one another. And Bernard knew that one of the challenges that we were going to see in these kids was we were going to see accumulations of heavy metals in their brain. And Art knew, based on being able to correlate functional movements with different structures in the brain, that the damage in the brain that these kids had existed primarily at the level of the pons in the midbrain. And so through their collaborations, Bernard figured out that, oh my God, the heavy metals are probably going to be behind the pons in the midbrain because that's where we're seeing the damage. So what you're seeing in your child is an indication of a dysfunctional pons. And with that, you're going to see anxiety, you're going to see sensory integration disorder, and you're going to see maybe a little bit of tentativeness, if not in the immediate family, in the bigger world. That child might have some insecurity. You're also going to see a profound impact on language and a whole bunch of other things. Obviously, when he gets up and creeps, we're going to see an artifact of the way he crawls in the way he creeps. We're going to see an artifact of the way he crawls in how he creeps up on hands and knees. And that creeping up on hands and knees in a quadruped position relates to the midbrain structures, which control a whole different set of functions that structure of the brain is responsible for. So we want to make sure that your child is not being limited by a structural problem, that there's not an issue in his spine somewhere that's literally preventing him from using his leg. And then we've got to put him through these really well choreographed patterns of movement that we do for him, that teach him what it feels like to use a reciprocating leg pattern and have the head in the right position and synchronize that with what the arms are doing. And after he gets directly instructed in that, we want to, as immediately as we can, put him on the floor and ask him to crawl. That's what makes the difference. If we keep putting a child down on the floor and asking him to crawl, they're going to continue to do it the wrong way. So we have to create an exercise or a set of inputs that is going to change his understanding of how he's going to use his body, and then give him the ability to do the output immediately after that. It's those two things in concert. You can't just do one or the other.
All right, so we have several more questions here. We're not going to spend too much time on diet, but someone asked, what specific dietary changes do you recommend besides dairy and probiotic? And
well,
let me throw in the second question. My child was born 24 weeks, right now experiences lack of focus, or rather hyperfocus, and needs to be moving all the time. Additionally, he has reactions that are out of proportion to the situation. Issues, transitioning, and rigidity, and sensory issues, ADHD, etc. How can this help? How long does it take? Is the program daily? He is 6. We currently use hand-in-hand parenting and OT intervention. Also, we use a naturopath.
Awesome. So, first question about nutrition and generally what I recommend. So, you can't take everything away from the child all at once. So, taking a food away that we know is bad and replacing it with a food that we would think is good is a simple way to start. Gluten is bad, casein is bad, soy is bad. And corn can be bad. Eggs can be really bad. But you look at your list of things that are typically problematic. You're looking at gluten, casein, corn, and soy, with eggs following pretty closely in that list of things. So removing. I always have people start with dairy, removing the casein, because that seems like an easier thing to do. And when the parents see how well that goes, then we move on to gluten. And when that goes well, then we look at doing testing. And I use a test at the office from a laboratory called KBMO Diagnostics. They have a remarkably sophisticated IgG test that looks at something called complement proteins. And that gives us a really thorough look at what is happening from a IgG perspective. We then know clearly which foods the child is sensitive to and which foods we have to eliminate. And they also give you a dietary plan based on those results as well. There's another company I'm really excited about called Excella, where they do metabolite testing, and that grades us in 5 different areas of health and can give a ton of feedback onto what sort of things we need to do for a child in terms of supplementation. And it's not particularly expensive. It's a really good value. So that's how I'd answer that question. And then the second part of the question being about a child who's having difficulty with transitions, having trouble with, I'm guessing that the way that was worded, we have a kid who can rage from time to time, if not frequently, who's having trouble with focus, and et cetera, et cetera. One of the first things we're looking at in a kid like that is anxiety, and not ADD and ADHD. A ton of ADD and ADHD is misdiagnosed anxiety. And when you take a child who's got anxiety that is creating a lot of nervous energy in the body, and you dump stimulant medication on it, you often get worse symptoms. And now the doctors are saying, well, we're going to keep them on the ADHD medication, but we're going to add an antipsychotic or a mood stabilizer of some sort. When really what the kid needs to do is probably have his ADHD medication, if not removed, at least halved, for better results. So what causes anxiety and what causes that? In my opinion, it's 2 things primarily. One is disorganization and dysfunction within the pons part of the brain that we spoke about earlier. And the second thing being a Moro reflex. So we can't work, the Moro reflex is, it's a startle reflex. It is triggered by an abrupt positional change or a loud noise. It is meant to be integrated very early on in life. And if it persists throughout life, you are going to have a lot of difficulty with transitions. You're going to end up being really controlling. You're going to have high anxiety. You're going to have a lower seizure threshold. It creates all sorts of problems. But we can't go after the Moro immediately. In my opinion, we have to begin working on correcting the developmental process, figuring out where the gaps are and filling those gaps in. And from there, we then need to start integrating other reflexes that are buttressing the Moro in place. And then one of the places we end a program is by integrating the Moro,
Awesome.
which is spelled M-O-R-O, by the way. My Boston accent doesn't sound bad to me, but it probably sounds bad to some of you.
It's perfect. It's perfect. Okay, here's another question. Do you have experience with children dealing with tick-borne disease and or neurovisual challenges?
So quite often, they're the same. Quite often, your tick-borne illnesses end up causing visual problems. And I am very friendly with a guy whose name is Dr. William Padula. He's based out of Guilford, Connecticut, and he can diagnose Lyme by looking at the fundus in the back of the eye. And he will then tell you what kind of Lyme-borne illness you have based on visually evoked potentials. He's doing some really interesting cutting edge work. So quite often, Lyme's will cause a problem within your functional vision. So yes, I have experience working with kids who have functional visual problems, and I have experience working with kids who have Lyme. There are a lot of things that need to be done for these kids, and it depends on how long they've had Lyme, when they contracted it, et cetera, et cetera. Detoxification is critically important. I have had a lot of success with, I work with a lot of not just kids. My Lyme population that I see at Active Healing, who I support, are largely adult. And so what we do for an adult who has Lyme is we need to do a lot of detox. I have a far infrared sauna at the office, really beautiful far infrared sauna. And we need to elevate the core temperature of the body to try to burn off the Lyme disease. So we stoke an artificial fever in the body using a far infrared sauna. We can't do that with a child of a young age because they don't moderate their temperature like an adult does. So that has to be used very cautiously. But detoxing with a ion cleanse foot bath, incredibly helpful for Lyme. There are now what we call there's something called the Lyme magnet protocol, where they actually use magnets I can't explain it very well, but basically what they're using is the electromagnetic field in the body to kill off or devitalize the Lyme-borne illnesses. And I have a lot of adults who come into my office, some before getting involved with a Lyme magnet practitioner, most afterwards. And everybody who's come into my office, with maybe the exception of one or possibly two people, have done extremely well with the Lyme magnet protocol. Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt and Dr. Lee Cowden both have really good Lyme protocols and are very familiar with autism. I believe Dietrich still feels, I don't want to speak for him, but I believe he still feels that anyone who has autism most likely also has a Lyme-borne illness. So they've got some really good protocols for both things, Lee Cowden and Dietrich Klinghardt, as well as many others, but they're two of my favorites.
All right, here's another question. I have two kids and neither crawled, but rather scooted on their butts. One has ADHD and significant anxiety, and the other is just fine. How can you account for the difference? I'm also going to throw a second question in there. How do you develop a program for a nonverbal child with global apraxia and ASD who cannot follow directions?
Yeah. Let's see, which one of those do I want to tackle first? So we'll go with the two scooters first. So first of all, I think when you're referring to crawling, what you're actually referring to is creeping. Crawling is on the stomach. Creeping is on hands and knees. So when you say that they crept by scooting on their bottom, I'm assuming you're meaning creeping. What you haven't isolated for me is, were there any differences in their crawling? There may or may not have been differences in their crawling, but differences in their crawling will give them different integrity at that lower functional brain stage of the pons. So that in and of itself, what happened before they scooted, can define how they react to the disorganization that exists at the midbrain level. The other factors are the level of subluxations or misalignments in their spine. So the Russians did some horrible experiments that were none the less interesting from a purely scientific perspective. They had two conjoined twins. Their names, I believe, were Masha and Dasha. Um, and so they were conjoined at the hip. So they had entirely separate nervous systems, different spines, different everything, but they shared the same blood flow. And because horrible things have happened in many different situations, the horrible thing that happened in this situation is when these conjoined twins were born, their parents were told that they died in childbirth. And then they were shuttled away and they were experimented on. And one of the experiments that they ran on these twins was they would inject them with a disease. And one would get sick and the other wouldn't. And yet they're sharing the same blood supply. The difference was the spinal alignment. One would have all of their body's adaptive resources available to it because there weren't inhibiting subluxations in the spine, and the other would have a subluxation in the spine in an area that was important based on whatever they injected, and that one would come down sick, while the other one would remain healthy. So there are a ton of different factors that determine our how resilient our bodies are, that go beyond just our neurodevelopmental experience.
Mm-hmm. All right, so how do you develop a program for a nonverbal child with global apraxia and ASD who cannot follow directions?
Well, that's the beauty of a neurodevelopmental consultant. We don't want to talk to your kids. We don't want to teach them any of this intellectually. So we put them on a table and we do all the movements for them. It's the same as if I'm dealing with an 8-month-old or a 6-month-old little girl or a little boy who doesn't have any language. We can take them through the same process as a 26-year-old male who doesn't have any language. We're not telling them what to do. We're taking them through what they need to do. In fact, we feel very strongly that when you tell a child what needs to be done, you circumvent your ability to be truly effective with them, because the parts of the brain that we're trying to impact through our practice are things like the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain, the corpus callosum, the cerebellum. None of these parts of the brain have the capacity to understand spoken or written languages, and they never will. The only languages that these parts of the brain can understand is touch and movement. And so we use touch and movement to take the child through this sequential process from the beginning to the end. And a program will begin with us doing these really choreographed movements for a child in which we are patterning into them as adults the movements that they need to incorporate into their body, and we're following that up with an output. And this is one of the major differences between what we do and what everyone else does. If we take a child, for instance, the child we were speaking about earlier, and we say, honey, I need you to use your right leg or your left leg when you crawl. They'll intellectualize that, but they're now controlling that movement from the cortex. It's no longer influencing, or it's not influencing as strongly as it could, the parts of the brain that we're targeting with that movement, because it's now being controlled by the intellectual part of the brain, or the cortex. So, and generally what happens is as soon as you tell a child to work on something that you're frustrated with, the rest of everything else that they're doing just falls apart because they're so focused on what their legs should be doing that now you're like, oh my God, what happened to their arms? Why are they holding their chest like that? Or and so you've corrected the one thing, but you've now created 4 other problems. So I just saw a question pop up from Katie.
All right, we have a going down in order here. So the
Yeah,
next one
okay.
is, do you find the academic piece to be the hardest last to change?
Well, it depends on the kid.
Depends.
Right. Some kids are only coming in because that's the only that's the only problem that they're having is some sort of learning disability, some sort of, intellectual piece. And oftentimes those kids go really quickly. But if you're talking about a more severely impaired kid, that's obviously the last thing that we're worried about. And the only way that I can answer that question is really to define the difference between the philosophy of a neurodevelopmental consultant and a typically trained physical therapist, occupational therapist, or medical, or what I call traditional medical or modern medical doctor. If I go in, let's say I've got a child who's got cerebral palsy and intellectual delay going on, and I take them to an orthopedic doctor. We're going to be given AFOs, and if the AFOs don't going to work, we're going to be told we can do botulism, or we can do this, or we can do that, or ultimately we can cut the heel cords and loosen and surgically loosen the heel cords and improve the child's structure. So we have a clear diagnosis, we have a clear treatment, and on the other side of that treatment, we have a very clear what we would consider a cure, right? We have diagnosed a child with tight heel cords, surgically loosen the heel cords, post-surgically, he should have loose heel cords. Very linear. When we look through the lens of vitalism, what we're seeing is a totally different picture emerge. So my job is not necessarily to take a child who is having an intellectual problem and turn them into a really bright academic student. My job is to make an adjustment. So rather than make a diagnosis, I make an analysis, and I say your child isn't using his right foot when he crawls, or his hands are fisted and he's on his elbows and he's dragging himself across the floor, or whatever variation it might be. And we need to start at this level, retrain this skill, and bring it up to health. So we go from making an analysis to making an adjustment to how that child moves. I don't know how that's going to pay off for that child ultimately, because what I'm doing is I'm releasing the child's innate intelligence. I'm allowing that child to heal based on whatever his innate priorities are. And I don't have any control over that. So for some kids, it may be that they stop having seizures. For other kids, they may continue having cerebral palsy, but they may suddenly be able to communicate with us like they've never been able to communicate with us before. So I'm unable to predict what releasing that child's inner potential is going to lead to in any specific kid. Now that said, I am working towards very specific goals, right? As I think all of us are. So when a parent comes in, a parent's main concern might be A, B, or C. That's very important for me to know because it's going to help me structure the program that I ultimately give that child. And I want to be aware of that. That said, I can't control the child's response because it really is more of an awakening.
Awesome. Thank you, Grant.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. What part, and Sharon, you may need to clarify this question for me. Sarge may understand it. what part of the brain would coding affect? And then the second part of that question is lack of oxygen. So I'm not sure.
What did you say? Coding?
hmm
I'm
What
not.
what part of the brain would coding affect lack of oxygen? Or maybe what part of the
Oh,
brain would lack?
coding as in, I'm assuming, um, losing heartbeat and respiration,
That's what I'm.
leading to
Oh, oh, okay. So she says flatline. Yes. So
yeah. Okay.
okay.
So, oh yeah. All
So
right.
what
Yeah.
part of the brain would be affected due to lack of oxygen, during a flatline situation?
Well, the answer to that is all of it,
hmm
right? Like, there's no part of the brain that's going to be spared by a lack of oxygen, um, unless the brain is in a state of hibernate. Well, I guess that's not exactly true. So, when a child is developing, they're born, and at the point that they're born, they should have a fully functional medulla, and they should be beginning to wire the pons. And so, but the midbrain structures, the corpus callosum, and the cortex are not fully myelinated yet. So, if a child loses oxygen at that time in their life, the upper levels of the brain are going to be protected somewhat by the fact that they're really not fully online yet. And that's going to confer, I would believe, a little bit of protection to those parts of the brain, assuming it's hypoxia rather than anoxia. So it's a reduction in oxygen as opposed to complete lack of oxygen, or the duration of time that either one is experienced. But once a child's brain, cortical structures, etc., are all myelinated, a lack of oxygen is going to impact everything. And restoring a child's oxygen becomes a really important part of that child moving forward. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Hyperbaric oxygen has gotten a lot of really good press. I've had a lot of clients do really well with hyperbaric oxygen treatments. We use a process called masking, which through the 10 or 15% increase in the carbon dioxide in the blood, triggers deep respiration from the lower lobes of the lungs, while simultaneously dilating all the blood vessels that are bringing now oxygen rich blood to the brain. And it leads to a remarkable 60 or more percent increase in blood to the brain. So that's really important. Movement is obviously really important. Breathing against your own body weight, as you do when you're on your stomach, but not when you're on your back, only when you're on your stomach, is really important to developing a deep chest and lung capacity. So whatever we can do to returning that child to a fully oxygenated state. I use a technology in the office. Um, well, so I use it. I've been using a technology since about 1999 called audiovisual entrainment, and we know that improves oxygenation, especially of the cerebral cortex. So that can be an awesome tool, but a child has to be able to tolerate it. It's wearing glasses and a pair of headphones, and you hear funny sounds and lights flash in your eyes, and it's an amazing, amazing technology. But not all kids will tolerate it, so you have to kind of build them up. I also use for my older kids who um, have suffered some sort of lack of oxygen. We'll do exercise with oxygen therapy, where we put them on a sonic whole body vibration machine that uses sound to vibrate a plate that they're standing on. These look like a lot of other pieces of equipment that you may have seen in your gym or your chiropractor's office, but they're sound based and they're remarkably different. And we'll put them on that, and I fill up a bag, a 900 liter bag of oxygen from oxygen concentrators. So I end up with 94, 95% pure, 900 liters of 94 to 95% pure oxygen. And we'll put them on a whole body vibration machine that opens up the cell membrane, deliver the oxygen at the same time. Because we're opening up the cell membrane, that oxygen can get pulled 250 times deeper into the cell. So there's a lot of different ways to work with oxygenation, but good, healthy neurodevelopmental movement is essential. Masking is essential. And then you can start talking about different technologies that you can use to oxygenate the body.
So next question. My son gets extensively stuck, like repeating a phrase over and over, and it turns into a meltdown. It's so severe, he doesn't allow me to speak as it triggers him so intensely. What part of the brain is this? Which exercises would help for this specifically?
So that's funny. I wouldn't be able to answer that question without seeing your child, without being able to assess his crawling and his creeping, because that could be a lot of different things. But my immediate gut reaction, it's not that he doesn't need neurodevelopmental movement, but that is a child who has almost certainly got a lot of biomedical issues, and those need to be addressed.
Okay. What was the name of the second testing company that you mentioned? They thought it was Excella. Could you just spell that for us, please?
I can. It is Excella, but it's spelled with an I. It's IXCELA.com.
IXCELA.com.
Yep.
Okay. Test for metabolites. It sounds okay. We got that.
Yeah, that's that. It's really about a year ago this past November. So what's that make it, like 18 months ago? This very nice woman and walked into my office during a very busy time and introduced herself. And in the course of our conversation, she said, "Oh, my partner Wayne can't wait to see you again." And it was busy, and the conversation was a broken conversation at best. And I don't know anyone named Wayne, but I didn't want to seem like a fool. So I said, "Oh, I'd love to see Wayne again." And I showed up in his office, and he's like 6'4" or something, and I'm 5'8". So he looks down at me, and I look up at him, and he says, "Well, look at you now." And I was like, "You knew it. You know my dad," because my dad and I have the same name. And, this guy's 70 something years old and my dad's 80 years old. And I figured my father's a commercial real estate broker. They'd probably met somewhere along the line. And he looked at me and he said, "I'm sure I've met your dad, but I remember you. And I think I still have blood in my files on you." To which I was like, "Huh? I've never met you before. How do you have my blood?" And he goes, "I met you when you were 8, and I did your medical intake." And this is a guy I met for the first time since then, 18 months ago. And he's the chief scientist at IXella. And he was working on metabolites on kids with issues back in the 70s.
Wow.
And he's developed all sorts of algorithms that allows him to look at specific metabolites. You can get a better picture of what's going on in the gut health by doing a finger prick and looking at the blood than you can by doing a stool sample. Because metabolites, generally, a lot of the important metabolites aren't excreted in the stool, but you will find them in the blood. And by looking at very specific metabolites in the blood, they can tell you about the neurological health, the immune health, the psychological health. It's a really interesting company that I'm just starting to work with. So I don't have a lot of experience, but I think it has a tremendous amount of promise.
Okay. So there's a couple of more biomed questions, but we'll come back to those. What do you do to integrate the moral at the end of neurodevelopmental movement?
Katie. So there'll be a couple of, there are some very subtle things that we do, and I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to answer that question for fear that some very well-meaning parent is going to go off and start working on the Moro with their child. They're relatively simple exercises. You do two things. We start off with, I won't tell you what we do, but it involves the child lying down on their back and literally doing 10 seconds of exercises. And that can be enough to radically upset the apple cart and send a child who's been doing incredibly well right back to where the beginning of the program was. And because the Moro is a very strong reflex that is a part of so much dysfunction, we have to go at it very slowly. And as I said earlier, there are reflexes that hold the Moro in place. So sometimes what we can do is we can eliminate those other reflexes, especially the symmetric tonic neck reflex, the tonic labyrinthine reflex, and in my experience, the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. We integrate those three things. A lot of times the Moro disappears because it's got nothing holding it in place. But those things generally need to be addressed before we start doing any work on the Moro, or the Moro is just going to persist because it's buttressed.
Kelly shares a beautiful story about her son. So thank you, Kelly, for sharing that. Someone else asked here, will you be talking about some of your biomedical devices? Will you write a book about your findings? I'd like that. There's another one. Is neurofeedback helpful? And okay, go with those, and then I'll ask a couple more questions. And how are you doing on time, Sarge? We don't want to overtax you.
No, I'm as I said, my wife is sound asleep at this point, or worse yet, she's watching a television show that I would much rather avoid. So,
hey, this is being recorded. Watch that.
She'll just laugh. She already knows. My wife goes to psychics every 5 years or something like that, and every single time she goes, the psychic says, someone in your family is going to write a book. My personal opinion is it's going to be my son, because I can barely get a business plan done, much less write a book about all this. As far as the biomedical pieces that I have in my office, I'll go for a very quick tour. So I wish I could see myself. I can't see myself. Maybe if I get the chat. Okay. So standing behind me are these very, one of my favorite things in my office, if not my favorite thing, are these whole body vibration platforms. All of them are sound. They are incredibly versatile. Behind me here, I do my ion cleanse detoxifying foot baths. I use a company called The Major Difference. They are by far the best company. You can see, I think you can see, the blue box right there is actually what controls it. And this array is what does the magic. So I use pedicure chairs, because who doesn't want to get a massage while they're also getting an ion cleanse detoxifying foot bath? This room is presently, I can't maintain a 6-foot distance from you and do NR. So this has become my little workout room. So that's my rowing machine. And that huge bag, see, this huge bag right here, when it's full, it gets full from those two machines right there. Those are oxygen concentrators. They fill up that bag with 900 liters of oxygen. And then, as of right now, I row. So I get oxygen while I row. Normally, that bag is set up by the whole body vibration machines. that right there, hopefully you can see it. That right there is a audio visual entrainment machine. Usually here I have a pulsed electromagnetic field mat. And in order to get the full idea of this, this is a far infrared sauna. The red light that you see is not where the far infrared light's coming from, because that could just as easily be green. It's those black panels right there, or we could do purple. So that's a far infrared sauna, and that one has been clinically shown to be able to increase your core temperature by as much as 2 to 3 degrees, which is why it's so good for Lyme disease and things of that nature. So, so those are my biomedical things. What other questions did we have?
All right. So other questions. Sorry about that.
Katie Kelly, about your about his heart condition. You're absolutely correct. That is one place where we don't do masking, is if a child has a serious heart condition. So we'd have to talk more about that. But he could still absolutely do neurological reorganization.
Can we do treatment remotely?
No. The reason for that is because I can do an assessment pretty effectively remotely, but in order for me to properly train you on how to do all of the necessary elements that are going to make up your child's program, I need to be there in person to do that, or you need to be here. There's a lot of hands-on stuff that takes place.
You and I can connect on that. We have a bunch of videos that we now use so that to supplement, especially during this time where we are able to do video assessment. So Sarju and I need to connect on that a little bit later. Someone asked, would love the link to the whole body vibration devices.
Let's put it in.
Okay. Another question. My son has a genetic mutation on SCN2A, gene 1, of the more prevalent genes associated with autism and infantile spasms epilepsy. He is 12 with autism, mostly nonverbal, no seizures since 1 year old. Will this program help him, and how does this differ from Muscatova? That's a good question.
That is a very good question. So more than likely, this program is going to significantly help your son. But how much, we're really unable to say, right? I generally have really good results with kids with autism, especially when we start bringing in all those other pieces. We start bringing in not just the neurological reorganization as kind of the center of your program, but when we start bringing in either a chiropractor or a craniosacral therapist, and we get really good nutrition, and we start a process of detoxifying, amazing things can happen for these kids. There's a huge difference between what we do and what Muscatova does. What Muscatova does, so the way it works, simplified way of it works, is we can start during the birth process. We could back up and we could go even further behind than that. But starting with the birth process, the child has many different tactile reflexes. So when the mom has a contraction followed by an expansion, that contraction triggers a spinal reflex that causes the child to go through a truncal pattern of movement and swim down the birth canal. Contraction stimulates the reflex, opens up, child swims a little bit, another contraction, more truncal movement, child makes his way a little bit further down, and this continues on. So quite often, a reflex is responsible for a movement that follows it. So we have a reflex followed by a movement. The movement integrates that reflex and removes it so it's not playing a role in our life actively anymore. That allows another reflex to surface, which ushers in a higher order movement that integrates that reflex and ushers in another higher order movement. What Moscatova does an unbelievably good job of is integrating reflexes. What it doesn't broach at all is the developmental process. So it's one thing to integrate a Landau reflex. When you integrate that Landau reflex, you want that child to experience crawling. When a child learns how to crawl, you think about globally how that's affecting the child. So they should be getting an alternating, a reciprocal leg movement with a strong toe dig. So we dig with the right toe and then we dig with the left toe. That digging motion, that firm planting of the toe, arches the bottom of the foot. It stretches the heel cord from where the heel cord attaches behind the knee and again at the base of the heel. It stretches that whole heel cord. It wears hip sockets. It helps develop the primary and the secondary curves in the spine. It teaches the child how to track across the horizontal plane. It improves hearing because of what it's doing for the curvature in the neck. We're getting our palms of our hands are being stimulated because if it's being done correctly with a firm toe dig, we're pulling our hands across the surface. They're not fisted, they're open, and we're stimulating the palms of the hand. We're learning how to rotate the wrists under the chest. There's a ton of stuff that is happening when a child is learning how to crawl. It's awesome to integrate an individual reflex, but you're missing a huge part of the puzzle if you don't work very strict with a lot of focus on the appropriate developmental movement at the same point. What's happening is not just impacting the arches in the bottom of the feet and the heel cords and the hip sockets and the secondary curves in the back and the vision. What you're really doing is you're working on the pons. So you're having this massive impact on the child. And Moscatova does an awesome job of removing the interference of the reflex, but it doesn't go back and recapitulate the entire developmental process. And as a result, I feel it misses on a lot of really important skills for a child.
Is neurofeedback
What's that?
Is neurofeedback helpful?
Neurofeedback is helpful. I actually prefer audiovisual entrainment, at least as a starting point. Audiovisual entrainment is a lot less expensive. You can buy a top of the line audiovisual entrainment system for between $525 and $595, depending on what pair of glasses you get with it. And you know, the most inexpensive that I've ever heard of neurofeedback being delivered is about $75 a session. Usually it's twice that, and you're looking at many sessions. So audiovisual entrainment, same thing. It's a brainwave entrainment technology. I think one of the advantages of it is that you're actually taking the child out of the feedback loop. So you're not asking them to control yet another aspect of their health and their wellness. You're actually allowing the machine to show them a pattern that is healthier. And so for me, that's more in line with what I do at work. The downside is a lot of kids would prefer to look at a screen. And so I love audiovisual entrainment. You close your eyes, the lights broadcast against your closed eyelids. Most people will have an experience of a ton of different color, even though we might only be shining white light in your eyes. Something called the Fechner response happens, and your eyes send confused messages of color to your brain, and you see this kaleidoscope of different geometric shapes of color vibrating and crossing in front of your vision. And it's a lot of fun. And when I do it with kids, I simply add a book on tape into the experience so they can be listening to, the Artemis Fowl series or Harry Potter or Charlotte's Web or something like that. And that usually will gain the enough favor that the kids actually look forward to doing it.
With AV questions, does that help calm a child who rages, goes from 0 to 100? Does it help with dyslexia? And is it safe or okay for kids that have epilepsy?
So we'll start with the epilepsy. So years and years and years ago, when I started using these machines, when you unwrapped the glasses, when you took them out of their case, there was a sticker on them, and the sticker said not to be used, or I can't remember if it said not. It was some sort of warning about epilepsy. They don't have to do that anymore because it is so rare. I have had, I think in all the years that I've been doing this, I've had maybe 3 kids have seizures, but none of their seizures were during their audiovisual entrainment experience. They all happened hours afterwards. For me, that's coincidental. Like if you go in for a seizure study and they try to provoke a seizure by flashing lights in your eyes, if it doesn't happen while you're in the testing room and while they're flashing lights in your eyes, they don't consider you as having stroboscopic seizures. So I've had a great deal of success with it. I've used it safely with a lot of kids who have epilepsy. Wouldn't be a big concern, but you should be aware that there is a risk associated with it. Michael Joyce, who's done this with literally tens of thousands of kids because he brought it in the school systems. When we had last chatted, which was many years ago, but when we had last chatted, he'd said that he'd had, I think, maybe 6 to a dozen people who had seizures, but none of their seizures were bad. None of their seizures led to exhaustion. They were able to get up after using the machine. They were able to get in their cars, drive home. They didn't have a recurrence of seizures after it. So I would say by and large with epilepsy, it is very safe. As far as how much it can help with a child who's raging, it's like a supplement, right? It's a lot about momentum, right? So if you're eating McDonald's 7 days a week for 2 meals out of every one, and then you're having a salad once a week, the salad's not going to do you much good, right? If audiovisual entrainment is part of an overall plan for a child, it can be really helpful. But I would never sell an audiovisual entrainment unit as a treatment, if you will, for rage or anything else, because there's a lot more going on there. What audiovisual entrainment is really good at is showing the brain that it doesn't have to be stuck in this one loop that it's stuck in, that the brain has a much bigger continuum of patterns that it can inhabit, and it ultimately makes your brain more athletic. So you're better able to adjust. So when it's time to go to bed, your brain can calm down and fall into sleep. And when it's time to be in the classroom, it can inhabit that perfect frequency range between 12 and 15 hertz. But if you want to go into your room and play Legos and create something amazing, you can slip down into 10 hertz and vice versa. So audiovisual entrainment is really good at making the brain more flexible.
Awesome. What do you think about glutamate reactions?
In what regard, I guess I would say to that? I would say that would be a better question for a certified clinical nutritionist or a mouse doctor than for me.
Great. What level of the brain stores PTSD and what specific movements hope to push that through? Is there a way to predict a cytokine storm?
So I tend to think, and this is simplifying it, but I tend to think that a lot of PTSD is rooted in the pons. I have one of my amazing clients who's graduated probably 6 months ago, but I worked with her for 18 months. An amazing woman. She was actually part of the New York Ballet. So, I mean, she was a dancer for the New York Ballet. Let me be more specific. So, as far as like watching her just sit down in a chair was entertaining. The way she moved her body, like everything flowed. It was just watching her stand up, watching her sit down, watching her just walk through a room. It was done with such grace and purposefulness that it was really remarkable to behold. And yet you put her, and she had all of this trauma from her childhood, from her upbringing, from her what I'll say her physical training as a ballerina, etc. So much of a history of kind of mental abuse and neglect, and just she had a rough childhood. And when we put her down on the floor and asked her to crawl, she could not do it. This woman who moved gracefully through every other aspect of life could not crawl on her stomach, despite the fact that she was a, a I guess ballerina. It feels weird. It feels childish to say ballerina, but a ballet artist or whatever with the New York City Ballet Company. I mean, very gifted movement person who couldn't crawl and whose creeping wasn't good either. But boy, could she, you know, pirouette and spin and do all sorts of things with her body that I could never hope to be able to do. So I really think PTSD is largely stored in the pons. What was the other part of that question, Jocelyn?
Is there a way to predict a cytokine storm?
Oh, yes, the cytokine.
Explain what a cytokine storm is.
That's a little bit above me. A cytokine storm is it's part of an overreaction of the immune system, and it puts children on the autism spectrum at risk from COVID-19, because a severe case of COVID-19 escalates into a cytokine storm. And so we want to be very careful of our kids who have that diagnosis around their exposure to COVID-19. There are a lot of herbs. So I wouldn't have been able to answer this question 3 or 4 weeks ago. But since COVID-19 has become such a prevalent thing in all of our lives, I have a woman, Sandra Bemis, who works out of my office sometimes. She's a hypnotherapist. She ran the business side of a farm for a long time. She knows a ton about herbs. She's a beekeeper. She's this wealth of information. She's amazing. And she was feeding me an enormous amount of research on what needs to be done to prevent the damage from COVID-19. And we can get into that in a minute. But one of the things that I learned from that is the way that you prevent a cytokine storm is with herbs and mushrooms. Mushrooms are really, really good. Um, so I do business with a company called Energetics. You can only get them through a practitioner. So you can't just walk into a store and buy them off the counter. You have to get them from an acupuncturist or chiropractor or me. Um, but it's called Core Mycelia. And it's a blend of all of these different types of mushrooms. And one of one of my clients who bought I've told all of my clients that I'm stocking Core Mycelia, and I've recommended to all my clients that they put it in their cabinets and they don't use it preemptively. They only use it if they feel like they're coming down with COVID-19. She felt like she was coming down with COVID-19. Like she spiked a high fever. She lost her taste and smell. She was really feel like every bone in her body hurt. And she was like, maybe I should try Core Mycelia. She got over it in 2 days. She tested positive, but she's now asymptomatic after 2 days of Core Mycelia. So, my answer to that would be look at, I think his name is Buhner, Buhner. He's got a lot of protocols for cytokine storms, and you can look it up by probably COVID-19. Um, who else? I look at herbalists. Look at herbalists for how you control cytokine storms. I think, and one of the nice things about herbs is you can use the bathtub as a remarkably therapeutic environment for delivering herbs to a child. So you literally go down, you take your herbs, you throw them into a pot, and you make a tea out of it. You know, you take a medium-sized pot, throw a bunch of whatever herbs you feel are necessary. You boil it all down, make a big tea. In the meantime, you've drawn a bath, put your kid in the bath. You then go and you take the tea and you dump it into the bathtub. And suddenly the bathtub becomes this incredibly therapeutic environment for the child. It's one of the best ways, in my opinion, to deliver herbs and all of their healing qualities to a child with autism because they generally love being in the tub.
Okay. So a couple more questions. We're going to end here in just 5 minutes or so. Can you train on the AVE remotely? And does the AVE help a child with dyslexia?
So for me, dyslexia is quite often a unintegrated asymmetric tonic neck reflex. And if you want to deal with the dyslexia, you're ultimately going to have to deal with the asymmetric tonic neck. At least needs to be looked at to see if that's what's going on. There can be issues with the corpus callosum quite often. If you do like localization of position or localization of touch on the child's body while they're blindfolded, dyslexic children will have a lot of trouble with that. Audiovisual entrainment is not going to touch on any of that. But audiovisual entrainment can do some things that I would think would be helpful just by increasing blood flow, by increasing focus and concentration that could secondarily positively impact a kid who has dyslexia. And the second part of that question is, audiovisual entrainment, there's a little bit of a learning curve, but I've actually put together an hour and 10 minutes worth of videos. When someone buys an audiovisual entrainment system from me, I send you out a symptom survey. I program your machine with as many as 6 additional programs that are specific to the situation that you're facing. And then you get a link to that hour and 10 minutes worth of videos that show you everything you need to know about using it. But then you also have access to me.
That's awesome. Okay, another question, and I believe this is our last question for the evening. Any additional questions, we will email them to you, if that's okay with you, Sarge.
That's fine.
All right, so I heard of metal detox. I think it is TRS detox. That is supposed to help kids with autism. Have you heard of it? Good or bad?
There's a lot of different ways to detox a child of heavy metals. My favorite way is these ion cleanse systems. TRS is one that I've heard of and I believe has some very positive results. Zeolite is another one. Excellent results. That's one that Dr. Klinghardt likes a lot. Um, you can use core cilantro. Oh, cilantro is a really good heavy metal binder that will help your child get rid of heavy metals, especially mercury. Um, chlorophyll is another really good one. I have a product here at Active Healing called Core Cilantro, which I really like. But when you're doing some sort of nutritional product, you need to make sure that you're opening as many detox pathways as you can so that the child doesn't simply redistribute those heavy metals in their system elsewhere. Um, so, again, super encourage people to look at Ion Cleanse by A Major Difference. Phenomenal company, incredible support. They even have an app that you download onto your phone that helps you figure out how long and how often you should be doing your ion cleanse foot baths. Um, and a tremendous amount of research that they've done on their product specifically. I think a lot of other companies try to validate their equipment by using the research that's been done on the ion cleanse systems by AMD themselves, or A Major Difference. They have a great Facebook page, by the way. Ion Cleanse by AMD for ASD. And you can just join that Facebook page and lurk and ask all sorts of questions. But you want to open up as many detox pathways as you can. So you've got to, if you're doing a product like that, you got to make sure they're drinking tons of water. You might want to get them on a mini trampoline, jumping up and down. If you have the wherewithal to do it, an ion cleanse detoxifying foot bath by A Major Difference is an awesome piece of equipment.
All right, I actually do have one more question that came in right before our cutoff time. What do you typically recommend for children with nonverbal learning disabilities?
Neurodevelopmental movement. So they're no different from any other kid. I want to do a screening. So I do screenings with a lot of my kids before I decide that they're a good fit for the program. So I'll look at them crawl, I'll watch them creep, I'll look at a couple of different reflexes. This can be done by video. This is easy enough that I can do these kind of screenings. As I said, the assessment's easy to do by video. It's the training that I can't do by video. So we can assess that, figure out what's going on, and see if he's a good fit for neurodevelopmental movement. If he's not, I'm likely going to be able to tell you where you do need to be looking.
Awesome. Awesome, awesome. I mean, what a wealth of information we received tonight. Thank you all so much for being on our webinar this evening. This evening's webinar was titled Mama, Help, I Want to Learn. And our guest speaker was Sergeant Goodchild. And my name is Jocelyn Williams, and I am the founder and executive director of Neurally Solutions. It has been a privilege to be here with you tonight. If you have any other questions, you can go ahead and type those in the chat box, and I will field those over to Sarge via email, and we'll try to get the answers to those for you. But it's been a wonderful evening, a long evening. I hope that you have a wonderful night, and I also want to invite you to join us each Thursday night at 8 p.m. For our webinars. Next week will be Homeschooling Is It For Me, hosted by Emma Eppard. And then on I believe it's the first Thursday in May, I'll just give you a little heads up here. You will be excited to know that Betty Lamont will be joining us in about 2 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. For being on our call tonight, we will add you to our mailing list. Do not worry, we're not going to spam you. I do not have time to spam anyone. We'll send you just one email a week just to let you know about our upcoming webinars and events. Again, it's been a great night. Sarge, before we close out, is there any last comments you would like to make?
I would close with this one statement. Movement disorders are never separate disorders. They are always central to what your child is facing. Don't ever let anyone tell you that the movement does not directly correlate to whatever struggle he or she is having. They are not separate disorders. And I would also like to thank everyone for their attention tonight. I know I'm long-winded, but I hope you all learned something from my talk tonight, and I appreciate those who attended. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant Goodchild, for being the guest speaker. Also, I thank all of the participants for joining us tonight on our webinar. Mama, help! I want to learn. My name is Esther Williams, the video director of Neurally Solutions, equipping the brain for life. For more information or to schedule an assessment, please connect with us on our website, neurally.com, via email at jwilliams@nsibrain.com, via text or call at 317-936-6797, or social media at Neurally Solutions. Thank you.